Benvenuti a questo nuovo evento del CICAP Fest. Oggi abbiamo un ospite che intervisteremo particolarmente interessante da ascoltare, la dottoressa Marthe Van Der Bles, che si occupa, che è interessata dal punto di vista della ricerca, lei è una psicologa sociale, a una questione davvero rilevante, e cioè come sappiamo ciò che noi sappiamo del mondo intorno a noi e della società nella quale viviamo e come processi di comunicazione influenzano questa nostra conoscenza. Marthe Van Der Bles è una psicologa sociale, appunto, è una ricercatrice e una docente che lavora in questo momento all'Università di Groningen e prima invece ha fatto un periodo di lavoro e di ricerca presso l'Università di Cambridge. Proprio al tempo di questa sua attività all'Università di Cambridge, diciamo durante questo periodo, ha scritto con alcuni colleghi un articolo interessante, importante, che cercheremo oggi un po' di sviscerare e che affronta proprio le questioni rilevanti del suo ambito di ricerca, in particolare relativamente, come vedremo, al tema della incertezza e di come questa incertezza viene comunicata. Da qui in avanti, appunto, come tutti i nostri eventi con degli ospiti stranieri, l'evento appunto sarà, io parlerò con la dottoressa in lingua inglese e poi appunto l'evento sarà sottotitolato. Intanto grazie per essere qui e per la vostra attenzione. Doctor, I'm very happy to have you here today for our CICAP Fest. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah.
Thank you. Recently, as I was saying in Italian before, you wrote with your colleagues an article for the Royal Society Review, a very interesting article concerning the communication of uncertainty in science. In the opening of the article, you introduce the concept of epistemic uncertainty, and you state that uncertainty is an inherent part of knowledge. Can you please explain what you mean with epistemic uncertainty and why this concept is important according to you?
Yes. So in any part of science and in many parts of life, there is some uncertainty. So every time you try to answer a question like how many trees there are in this world, you can make a calculated guess, or you can do a study that tries to find out how many trees there are on the planet. But it's very hard to count them all. So many times we estimate, for example. And that means that there is not only the estimate, but also the uncertainty around the estimate. And in everyday life, there are you can make a distinction between two kinds of uncertainty. The first is aleatory uncertainty, that is has everything to do with events that we can't know, and typically those are events that take place in the future. So we can't know what happens tomorrow because there is some randomness and chance involved in what will happen and whether something will happen. In contrast to that, you have epistemic uncertainty, and epistemic uncertainty concerns itself with uncertainty that arises because we don't know. So theoretically, we can count every tree on the planet. It's very time consuming, we won't, but theoretically we can. And the fact that we don't know exactly how many trees there are means that the uncertainty is, if we get a better measurement opportunity to estimate these trees, the uncertainty will reduce. So epistemic uncertainty is uncertainty that arises because we don't know. And that then typically is involved in our knowledge about the past and our knowledge about the present. So our knowledge about the past can be uncertain because of, for example, a lack of good instruments to measure something. And that kind of uncertainty can be reduced when our instruments get better. So that is what the big difference, the distinction that we make, and why we concern ourselves here with epistemic uncertainty only.
Okay, thank you. And in the article, you observe that we are living in an era of contested expertise, as you wrote, and that for this precise reason, many experts shy away from openly communicating their uncertainty about what they know, fearful of their audience's reaction. In your opinion, what are the most significant indicators of the fact that we are living in an era of contested expertise, as you wrote?
Well, there are some indicators that suggest that trust in institutions, for example, is going down in some countries. More anecdotally, in the UK, there was a big national debate around experts not being trusted anymore. But I think so one of the things that's interesting about this work is that we wrote this and published this before Corona happened, the Corona pandemic. But in the Corona pandemic, there are a lot of examples of why this is relevant. And one of the prominent indicators, I would say, I see in my own country is the struggle around the communication of the uncertainty that exists around vaccination, about vaccine safety. And on the one hand, you see many people, or like many scientists and many policymakers struggling to really find a way to incorporate that into their communication. But at the same time, also groups of people being really hesitant about the expertise and the trusting the institutions and the scientists in this, and trying to find their own information somewhere else. So I think that's the one of the most prominent indicators that I see now, that isn't in the paper as much, but that I see now, is that the willingness of many people to try to look for their own information and find that online, away from the kind of older institutions, so to say, or like science in general.
One could say that communicating uncertainty is not an issue only in the world of science, but can also have an impact in policy decisions. In your article, for example, you cite the cases of two reports produced by the British and US governments to support their decision to go to war against Iraq. What did it mean in those cases to communicate uncertainty? And I would say, which problem arose in those cases?
Yeah, so there, after this all happened in the UK, there was a big review of how the decision was made to actually go to Iraq, because indeed this was based on the assumption that there were weapons of mass destruction, and later it was found that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And what the review turned out, what the conclusion of that review was that all the uncertainty that was in the intelligence that the intelligence agencies had gathered wasn't really communicated very well up to the public report that the decision makers used to make their decision. So the fact that the uncertainty that did exist around the information that they had, that was not taken into account properly, not communicated properly up the chain towards the people who had to make the decision in the end, led to the fact that it was completely discounted. It wasn't taken into account at all, and therefore the decision was made to go to war. So this is, I think, a really good example of how that uncertainty about information, about facts or knowledge that we think we claim to have, can have really serious consequences if it isn't taken into account properly, if it isn't communicated properly.
Mm-hmm. To understand the problem of communicating uncertainty, you propose to use the classic Laswell's model of communication, adapting it to this specific issue. Can you illustrate for our listeners how you have conceptually framed the problem from this point of view?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do is to come up with a framework, a model for understanding everything that is involved in the process of communicating epistemic uncertainty. So communicating uncertainty about facts, numbers, and science, and the type of uncertainty that arises because we don't know, but theoretically could know something. And we ended up summarizing this in indeed using Laswell's model to provide a framework. And I really like that model because of its simplicity. It states that the factors that are important in communication can be summarized in one sentence, and that sentence is who communicates what, in what form, to whom, and to what effect. So who does the communication? That's one factor to think about. What is communicated? In what form is it communicated? So is it in spoken? Is it written? Is it visual? To whom? Who's the audience towards we are communicating the uncertainty? And what is the effect that both the people communicating want to have? So that's one thing to think about, as well as what is the effect that it has when uncertainty is communicated. And for each of those factors, each of those steps, we thought about kind of the relevant, within the context of epistemic uncertainty communication, what the relevant things are to think about.
So we discussed epistemic uncertainty earlier, which I understand is about what to communicate in your model. Can we further specify how this uncertainty differs in different areas of science?
Yeah, so this was one of the big challenges in this work, of course, because what we wanted to say is indeed we wanted to come up with a model or a framework that is relevant to many different areas of science. And at the same time, whereas almost all areas of science deal with epistemic uncertainty, it is very broad and varied in the way in which they do this. So it can be conservation biology. So how many tigers are there still left in India at the moment? So then you're talking about having one specific number that there is uncertainty about based on how well you're able to actually spot and count the tigers. In economics, we're talking about the uncertainty around economic indicators, for example. So that could be a simple one that I've used in research is the number of unemployed people, which I always assumed would be some kind of count that we kind of know how many people actually are unemployed, but it isn't. That's too complex. So it is an estimate as well based on survey data. And that means that because it's based on survey data, there is a lot of uncertainty around that specific estimate, but also indicators like the GDP have massive uncertainty around them that is very hard to actually quantify. Medical science, so how effective is a certain treatment? What do we know about the effectiveness both of the treatment in general, but also then about the effectiveness of the treatment for an individual patient? In my own field, in social psychology, so how certain are we about the relationships that we aim to research and discover? So I think we ended up summarizing kind of that in general, when we talk about all fields of science, what we're uncertain about is either a fact, and that can be almost a binary statement. For example, the summer Antarctic ice sheet is reducing in size. That is either true or not true. It's a number. So for example, the number of the degree with how many degrees the world has warmed so far. Or it is a hypothesis that the warming of the Earth is due to the greenhouse effect. That's a scientific hypothesis, for example. And in all fields of science, we're typically dealing with one of those three things that you can be uncertain about.
In the article, you discuss a quite interesting case concerning the way in which an institution such as the International Agency for Research on Cancer tried to simplify uncertainty communication when they present their list of cancerogenic elements and the problems that can arise as a result. For example, we saw many of these problems in Italy when we discuss about the potential danger of mobiles. Can you please illustrate this case to our listeners?
Yes, I think that's a really interesting one. So one more thing to then explain first is that if you think about what you are uncertain about, we also propose that in communicating the uncertainty, you can distinguish between two kinds of uncertainty about this fact, number, or hypothesis. That is the direct uncertainty. So that is, for example, if you talk about the number of tigers, the range around that number. Or indirect uncertainty. So this is the uncertainty that arises because of the quality of the evidence that we have. So in the case of the number of tigers in India, that would be how well are ways to count them. So the tracking the footprints in the mud, for example, like how good a method that is to be able to count tigers. There is uncertainty around the quality of that evidence, and that it is also important to take into account. And what you see in many cases of organizations which deal with lots of information and try to simplify that into, in the IARC case, so about cancer, in 4 categories, basically. So what they want to do is to communicate whether something causes cancer, probably causes cancer, we don't know, or does not cause cancer. And in trying to simplify that, in the IARC's case, they combine information about the strength of the effect and about the quality of the evidence. So how good is our understanding of the science? How certain are we that there is a relationship between, for example, cigarettes and cancer, or processed meat and cancer, as well as how strong is that relationship? And if you conflate the two, what can happen is what happened a while ago, when the classification for processed meat came out, is that in that case, what we know is that processed meat, the science says there is enough evidence that to suggest that consuming processed meat causes cancer. But the size of that effect is not very strong. It is there, but it's not a very strong effect. So, but that subtlety, because it is conflated into one, gets completely lost in communication, meaning that at least in the UK and in the Netherlands, where I was at the time, or at least I was in the UK at the time, but I could follow the Dutch news as well, of course. And when this news came out, everyone, like all the news was around the processed meat, eating bacon in the UK was very dangerous because it causes cancer. Whereas what we know is that there is a link. So similar to cigarettes, we know that it causes cancer, but the risk itself of consuming processed meat is a lot lower than it is, for example, to smoke.
So may I add a question on this issue? Do you think finally that the problem here has to do with the desire of simplicity, or with the lack of comparisons, for example, in communicating such? So that when you present the data, or when you present the list, you don't make clear how to compare things.
I think ultimately the problem is the desire for simplicity, and probably the lack of real understanding of what the consequence of that simplicity might be for different audiences, because the simplicity itself is not, like, for the experts that deal with IARC's information, the International Research for Institute for Cancer Research information. Those experts know how to interpret the classification, but the fact that the rest of the world doesn't is lost in the communication effort. But at the same time, that could be addressed, I think, by making more appropriate comparisons. So yes, but it's one of the fact that for simplicity's sake, they're combining all different types of uncertainty that together make communicating to at least the general public a lot more difficult, is something that institutions should really be aware about.
So more broadly, what are the problems that science communicators or scientists face when deciding how to communicate uncertainty? And I would ask, in this area, from your review, what role can images play in building effective communication of uncertainty?
Images are really interesting. So the kind of the decision that you have to make as a communicator of uncertainty is taking into account what kind of uncertainty you have, and in what way you can communicate it. So are you able to do it visually, or are you in this context, for example, I'm talking, so I won't be able to show pictures. Then it's really important to think about who you are communicating to, so what your audience is, who your audience is, and what their relationship with with you as a communicator and with the thing that you're trying to communicate about is, because this might influence everything. The kind of the sad thing about this review is that what we kind of discovered in our work is that there is not that much known about the effects yet. Sorry, the very practical advice is difficult to give, but and that is also the case for images. So what we know from, there has been very little work done on the effects of communicating uncertainty visually specifically for epistemic uncertainty communication. But what we know from relevant other work in the health context, for example, there's been review work on communicating uncertainty visually, is that one thing is that you have a lot of opportunities to do it. So there are a lot of ways in which visually you can add uncertainty to the thing that you're trying to communicate. So both with error bands, or with shading, with different colors, you have all kinds of options. But the features of an image that people prefer to see, that people like, are not necessarily the same features that help communicate better, and are also not necessarily the features that end up to have people make better decisions or trust the data better. So, and I think will probably be true for uncertainty communication as well. So that's the things that make images look really pretty and people like to see them are not necessarily the same things that help them understand what they're actually seeing.
Mm-hmm. If I can ask you more, let's say, an opinion, because in my question before, I spoke about how scientists communicate and how communicators communicate. So in your experience, do you see a potential conflict or an actual conflict between these two categories, since they work on the same issue, which is communicating science? Did you see any sign of this in your experience?
Yes. So in my own experience of like being a researcher in my field, what happens often, of course, is that as a scientist, you try to do good work, good science, to tell something about what you have found, but also about the uncertainties around that. And then you're pushed towards coming to a conclusion that communicates easily. So that already within the own science that you're doing, it is important to have a good, clear take-home message, which means that the uncertainty around what you find can already be a bit in the background. And what I then see is that if your findings are communicated by communicators, it might be that this uncertainty gets even less attention than it is than that's necessary. And I don't think it's easy to. I don't necessarily think that you can lay blame on any party involved, but it is definitely a process that can have really adverse consequences if the uncertainty disappears completely. And you can see that mostly in media headlines. That's of course the kind of the level of communication in which people want to really draw readers in. So then typically claims are way overstated. But that can have real consequences in how the public views what science is, what we do, and what we can find, what kind of claims we can make. Yeah, so I think there is responsibility on part of the researchers to be clear about what you can and cannot conclude from your findings, and also on the side of the communicators to really also think about, and some of them are really good at this, some of them are really some science communicators in media landscape, for example, are really critical readers of scientists' work, but also indeed there to really think what kind of claims can be made.
In discussing about the target of communication, your review emphasizes the relevant role that our pre-existing beliefs play. What do studies in the field of uncertainty show in this regard?
So here indeed we're talking about the kind of the broader social psychological or the psychological process, that's the information and the beliefs that you hold yourself have an influence on how you process any new information that you find. So if you very much like eating apples, for example, then you're quicker to spot a sign for apples in a supermarket. So you process that information quicker. And there has not been done that much work, but there have been a couple of studies applying this to communicating uncertainty specifically. And one of them, for example, looked at people's interpretation of uncertainty ranges. So they used climate change as one of the examples in which they gave people information about the surface temperature level change, so how the Earth warming up. And they said the Earth has warmed up somewhere between 0.5 degree and 10 degrees, and then ask people within that range, 0.5 degree to 10 degrees Celsius, what is the most likely value? So is the most likely true value somewhere in the middle, making that you can have a normal distribution, or are all values equally likely, or are the lower end values more likely, or the higher end values more likely? And what they found is that people's ideas about climate change influenced what they thought was the most likely true value. So if people were really concerned about climate change, they thought that either the middle values are more likely, or the higher values are more likely, compared to people who are not very concerned about climate change at all. They thought that the lower values were more likely, or all values were equally likely. So this means that the way in which the prior beliefs that people have about certain topics can influence how they interpret the information that you give them. And that is, of course, something that's really good to be aware of as a communicator of your findings to a particular audience.
Yeah. And since we have moved closer to the psychological dimensions, and in particular the topic of the impact that communicating epistemic uncertainty has on the public, I'd like you to help us identify what the most relevant findings in this research area are, both on a cognitive and emotional level.
I think on a cognitive level, the most relevant finding is that, this is something that's really well established. So this is also something that I feel quite certain to say is going on. Is that there is a massive variation in how people interpret expressions, words that indicate uncertainty, and also these ranges, as I talked about earlier. But what research has shown is that if you ask people, so a word like likely or very likely, if you would have to express that in a percentage, so does that mean how likely do you think something is? What percentage of chance do you think that has of happening? Is that one person will say, I think that if something is likely to happen, that means that it is at least 60% chance of it happening. And another person will say, I think it is at least 75% chance of it happening. And this means that if you communicate uncertainty verbally, that words like something is likely to happen, something is very likely to happen, something is unlikely to happen will be interpreted differently by different people, and sometimes even differently by the same person in different contexts. And this is, I think, very important information. One of the examples that I now think about is earthquake risks, in which sometimes people say, or the communication can be, it is unlikely to happen. But then it differs. Then it's important to know whether unlikely means it's less than 1% chance or it's less than 10% chance. And the fact that verbal communication can be interpreted very differently is something that is important is an important finding, I think, important to consider in communication. And if we're talking about emotions, the literature there is very scattered, very scarce. So there's not much of a conclusion to be drawn, except that given that the findings that there are very variable. So some in a few studies, uncertainty communication did seem to have an effect on people's emotions. In others, it didn't seem to have an effect. One of the things that I think we can conclude is that it seems that it isn't necessarily having strong effects on people's emotions, and that might be interesting in itself. So more research should be done there, but it doesn't seem to be necessarily the case that if you communicate uncertainty, that people will have a very strong negative emotional reaction to that.
One could notice from what you said that it may be strange that in psychology research we know more about cognition, we know less about how emotion impact or impacted by this communication of uncertainty. Because, I mean, from a naive perspective, one could think that psychology concerns more an emotion side of life instead of, while in research, it's in many cases what you see, that we assume more a cognitive perspective than one on emotions, which can be an issue, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very good conclusion to it. Yeah, that's a very right thing to say. Yeah.
Another relevant area is that of trust in experts. We already said something when we started our conversation. What do we know about the effects of communicating epistemic uncertainty on trust? Also,
there has been very little research done, or at least when we wrote this review, there was very little research done. So this is one of the things that I try to study more myself. We did some empirical research to specifically look at this question. So does uncertainty communication affect or decrease trust in the information that you're communicating? In our case, we focused on numbers, so the numbers of tigers in India, the number of unemployed people. If you communicate uncertainty around that, does that affect people's trust in a number? And does it affect people's trust in the producers of that number, so the scientists behind the number? And what we found in that research is that if you communicate uncertainty verbally, so in sentences, in words, it seems to have a small effect, a small decrease in the trust that people have in the number itself, which you could argue is reasonable if you had not expected that the number of unemployed people is something that there is uncertainty about. The fact that you make people aware of it should lower their kind of trust in that specific number somewhat. But it didn't impact on people's trust in the source of the number, so the scientist, at all. And I think that's really interesting. There are some there are a few other studies. There is, for example, one old focus group study in a health context, in which they had people in little groups talk about uncertainty around certain breast cancer treatment, I think. And there, the researcher found that communicating uncertainty had different effects for people who were more highly educated and more had a lower education level. So I won't claim that like uncertainty doesn't have any effect in any context. I can imagine that in certain contexts there might be effects on the trust in the data or the communicators. But at least my own research indicates that it can be the case that you can communicate uncertainty without it affecting trust in the science or scientists behind it. And we took that to be an optimistic message, because that means that there's not a strong excuse to not communicate it, right?
So one of the most perhaps one of the most interesting aspects, as you write, as you wrote in your paper, is the impact of communicating uncertainty on people's behavior and decision making. What do the studies tell us about these issues?
So one thing to say here is that for any also psychologists, other psychologists listening, is that if we look at the field, or that there's a lot of research done on communicating uncertainty about the future, so risks about the future, and there are a lot more studies done there about the effects that has on people, and that they might be averse to that, and that it might have negative consequences. And in the review, we really try to focus on only studies that looks at communicating epistemic uncertainty, so the uncertainty that doesn't have anything to do with the future, or with uncertainty that is there because we can't know something, but really look at uncertainty because we don't know something. And there again, there's very little actual research. There are a few studies that look at situations that are a bit mixed between these types of uncertainty, and there are within those few studies, there are studies that suggest that people can also make better decisions when uncertainty is communicated, which we thought was really interesting. So again, there might definitely be instances in which it might hamper communication, good decision making when you communicate uncertainty. But one of the examples of a study that looked at decision making was, for example, in which the researchers looked at uncertainty within the weather forecast situation. So this is, of course, a type of uncertainty that people are really used to. There is a prediction of whether it will rain tomorrow, but whether it will actually rain there is some uncertainty about that, and that's kind of something that people live with, understand very well in their daily lives. And they asked, within the study, they asked people to pretend that they were a road maintenance company, and they had to prepare the roads for very cold weather and snow or not. And what they found in that study is that if they communicated uncertainty around the weather forecast, people performed better, made better decisions in the end than if the uncertainty wasn't communicated. So this suggests that there are contexts in weather. There's also some work in finance, so uncertainty around financial decision making, for example, in which people actually perform better, make better decisions when the uncertainty is communicated.
So since we are considering specific issue, the last section of your review presents two very interesting cases of uncertainty communication. The first is in the economic domain, and the second in the climate change domain. So what do they add to what we have discussed so far?
So we basically use those as examples of illustrating kind of our framework. So the model of if you think about communicating uncertainty, what you need to think about is who communicates what to whom, in what form, and to what effect. And we use those as kind of case studies, as examples of illustrating all those factors within that context. And I think what we learn from those is that if you look at economic statistics, for example, uncertainty isn't communicated very regularly, while experts in that field really know and recognize that it is there. There are also some examples of, for example, the Bank of England in their communication. They do try to at least include uncertainty in their figures very well, but it isn't something that is taken up in a more general discussion of economic figures in kind of the media. Or in kind of a more national debate. So when people talk about, when the general public gets economic statistics communicated towards, typically that is without any information about the uncertainty of those statistics, while in some cases the uncertainty is really big. And that is something that economists might really think about, whether that is the best way to go forward. And I think what we learned from the climate change case study is that the IPCC is one of the big, because climate science is so uncertain, and because understanding the science is so uncertain, like it is science, which in which there is inherent uncertainty, like in all science, but the uncertainty has become really important in understanding what we know about how to act towards climate change, and is something that has been used by proponents and opponents of the kind of climate change, whether the climate is changing, to steer the debate. There has been a lot of attention within this field in how to communicate uncertainty. So one of the things that we learned there is that the IPCC has made useful classifications in trying to link these uncertainty words that I talked earlier about, that have very variable interpretation. So a word like likely, that people interpret in very different ways. They standardized the way in which they communicate those kinds of words, meaning particular kinds of things in their texts. And on the one hand, the fact that they've done research about that means that we know that even within their texts, people can kind of misinterpret the meaning of those findings. So if IPCC says something is very likely, they mean there's a 90 to 100% chance. And people, if you ask the lay public what they think the IPCC means with very likely, most people will say something lower than that. So there's still, but at least we know this. So one of the things that is very interesting in the context of climate change is that there is actually some research being done on this, and there are a lot of developments in the uncertainty communication.
Mm-hmm. So in your concluding remarks, you present a list of, let's say, practical tips that may be useful for those involved in uncertainty communication. Can we briefly share them with our public?
Yes, I think that's a good thing to do. I think what we would advise people, both scientists and other communicators of uncertainty, but everyone who deals with facts, numbers, or science, and with the uncertainty that comes with that, if you think about communicating this, it's good to first consider what is it actually that you're uncertain about. So is it about the fact or number that you're trying to communicate, or about the underlying hypotheses that around the process? It could be all of them, of course, but it is at least good to first analyze for yourself, where actually do I have the uncertainty? What am I uncertain about? And why is it there? Because the source of the uncertainty, there is not much empirical work on this, but at least we propose that the source of uncertainty might be important, at least in designing what you can communicate. So it's different, of course, when the source is sampling error, or when it is kind of a faulty measurement apparatus. And if you have thought about those, it's also good to then think about the different types of uncertainty that we distinguish. So what the uncertainty that is direct about the number of factor hypotheses, and about the underlying, the indirect uncertainty about the underlying, the quality of evidence. If you know what you want to communicate, so what the object is and what the uncertainty is, then you can think about who you are communicating to, who is your audience, and what is their relation to you and to the object of uncertainty. So is it a topic that is very emotionally laden for them? Is it something that do they trust you beforehand or not? Do you know those kind of things? And kind of what is your for the medium of expression or the medium of communication that you have towards your public? And those kind of factors will inform what kind of expression of uncertainty you can choose. So will this be something that can be like a full probability distribution in a graph, or will it be something in a sentence, in a particular type of text you can choose? And then it is important to consider what effect you want to have on your public, on your audience. What you would like to achieve. So do you want to inform the public of your audience of something, and what you can consider you might achieve. So do they need to make a decision? Do you think you will affect any of their emotions? Those are important to think about within this context.
And after reviewing the most important research findings in this area, what do you think should be the most important questions that upcoming research should address?
Well, I think the lack of any information or any knowledge that we have about the effect on decision making is something that I think is really important to address. That is also something that I think we can clearly see. That of course there is a lot of research being done, but one of the issues that I think is very prominent, at least in my mind at the moment, is it concerns the COVID pandemic and vaccine safety, for example. So the uncertainty around that is inherent into the process of developing a vaccine and testing vaccines. So that is something that can, of course, has a place in communicating around what we know about these vaccines and the safety, and how the public should decide on whether to get vaccinated or not. And I think how that process works and how uncertainty then affects the decision making is something that would be really interesting to study, and is really important to study.
Is this, if I may ask, is this something you're working on, or you're working on different topics?
No, it's not something I'm working on at the moment, but it is something that's high on my list. If I have time to start working on this is something that I think it's a nice cases as well, right? It's I think that's really interesting with this work, that in the pandemic, because it is completely new. This virus was completely new when it started, and there was so little known within science about it. It's been really interesting to watch this as a case study in a way of the need for uncertainty about what we know about this virus to be addressed also in kind of a wider setting than typically scientific uncertainty is being addressed at. And I think it's been really, I think it's been really interesting to see finally, in a way, kind of there being a case in which the uncertainty is really prominent and really important to take into account, and therefore is something that is a bit more communicated a bit more than it would normally have been. But that also opens up a lot of questions, of course, on the effects of it. Yeah.
Okay. So let me say thank you very much for your participation in our CICAP Fest and for sharing with us your knowledge and expertise on this field, which is quite important for our time. So let me conclude in Italian for our public, and again, thank you very much for your participation today. Allora abbiamo terminato questa intervista, spero che sia stata interessante per voi così come lo è stata per me ascoltare la dottoressa, proprio perché appunto il tema che abbiamo affrontato oggi è davvero un tema cruciale, e come appunto lei stessa ci ha detto nelle sue parole finali, in questa situazione di pandemia abbiamo visto quanto sia rilevante questa indagine sulla comunicazione dell'incertezza, e quindi vi saluto, vi ringrazio per l'attenzione e arrivederci nei prossimi eventi del CICAP Fest. Grazie mille.